No one, least of all Lena Hart, thought this was a story about a disappearance. If you were to build a person designed to survive the wilderness, you'd build someone like Lena. At 29, she was careful, methodical, the kind of person who counted her iodine tablets twice and checked the weather reports from 3 different sources. She wasn't a casual weekend warrior. She was a seasoned hiker who had summited treacherous glaciers in the Cascades and navigated the disorienting, knife-sharp lava beds of Hawaii. She understood that the wild was honest. It didn't have motives, it just was, and she respected it. But that spring, the neat, orderly world of marked trails and alpine meadows wasn't calling to her. Something else was. The profound, brutal emptiness of the Utah desert. The sand hollows, a place with no crowds, no permits to pull, no one to check you in or check you out. A place where you could get lost in the silence. She had been preparing for it for months. She'd quit a high-stress job at a biotech startup in Salt Lake City, trading a world of clean rooms and data analysis for the dusty, sun-bleached solitude of Moab. She told her friends she needed a reset. She wasn't running from anything, not really. But her journals, which would later become a roadmap to her own mystery, suggested she was running towards something. She wrote often of dreams, of old, forgotten places that seemed to call out to her from just beyond the edge of the map. The plan itself, on paper, was flawless. Textbook, even. The Copper Ridge Loop, a 22-mile trail that was challenging but well-documented. She told her co-workers at the small nonprofit where she'd been cataloging desert flora that she'd be back Sunday night. The last time anyone can say for sure they saw Lena Hart alive was at 10:12 a.m. on a Friday in May. She was at a dusty gas station on Route 89, filling her water jugs, buying a bag of trail mix. She was chatty with the cashier. Friendly. Said she was excited to finally get out there. Then she drove her old, sand-colored Subaru Outback 3 hours south, parked it neatly at the Copper Ridge trailhead, and was gone. Her sister, Chloe, received a text at 8:43 a.m. that morning. Just a single line, no photo. Heading out now, Copper Ridge to the loop. We'll check in Sunday. Simple, confident. The last words she would ever send. When her car was found, windows cracked just enough to vent the oppressive heat, it told a story of temporary absence. A half-full, reusable coffee mug sat in the cup holder. A pair of backup hiking boots were in the trunk. Nothing suggested she planned on being gone forever. But the Copper Ridge Loop, it turned out, was just the public story, the official itinerary. Lena had a different destination in mind. Locals and serious hikers whispered about it. The homestead, a place that wasn't on any map. The skeletal remains of a cabin, supposedly built by a reclusive prospector back in the 1930s. No road led to it, no marked trail pointed the way. It was a local legend, a rite of passage. If you found it, you took a picture. If you were brave, you stepped inside. Lena's notes, recovered later from her apartment, were filled with it. Coordinates pulled from old mining maps, hand-drawn sketches of a lonely cabin nestled in the bluffs, and a single, cryptic line, underlined twice. What's buried doesn't always stay buried. She wasn't just going for a hike. She was looking for something. And somewhere out there, in that vast, indifferent silence, the desert decided to let her find it. Sunday night bled into Monday morning, and the silence from the desert became a screaming alarm. Lena Hart was punctual to a fault, a human clock. When her check-in text never arrived, her sister, Chloe, felt the first cold tendrils of dread. By dawn, after a sleepless night of unanswered calls that went straight to voicemail, the dread had sharpened into panic. At 9:40 a.m., she filed a missing person report. The first ranger arrived at the Copper Ridge trailhead just before noon. Lena's Subaru was exactly where it should be, parked neatly under the sparse shade of a dying juniper tree, its paint already veiled in a fine red dust. The scene was unnervingly normal. There were no signs of a struggle, No broken glass, no blood. Her phone and pack were gone, as expected, but everything else was untouched. Trail maps sat in the console. A pair of backup hiking boots were stowed in the trunk. A reusable coffee mug, still holding a half-inch of cold coffee, rested in the cup holder. It was the picture of a brief pause, a temporary absence. It looked like she had simply stepped out to stretch her legs and would be back any minute. The Rangers made the call to leave the car, not wanting to contaminate what was rapidly shifting from a search for an overdue hiker into a potential crime scene. The official search began in earnest by Tuesday afternoon. The desert, which had been Lena's sanctuary, became a grid. Helicopters, their rotors beating against the vast, indifferent sky, swept the canyons. Volunteers on ATVs, kicking up plumes of red dust, scoured the dry washes. Canine units were flown in from Salt Lake City, but the relentless winds and baked earth rendered scent trails useless. The case was upgraded. Lena Hart was now an active, high-priority search. But a heavy, unspoken truth hung in the buzzing heat of the command post. For a hiker this experienced, on a trail this defined, she should have been found by now. Chloe arrived that evening, her face a pale mask of exhaustion. She didn't speak as the lead ranger walked her through the timeline, pointing at maps pinned to plywood boards. She just stared at her sister's car, her eyes fixed on a small, familiar dent in the rear bumper, a meaningless little imperfection they had laughed about months ago. Now it was a relic, the last tangible piece of Lena's world left behind. The first real clue materialized at sunrise on Wednesday. A volunteer, combing the canyon floor on foot, called it in. Footprints. A single, solitary trail leading away from the marked path and into the wash. The boot tread was a perfect match for the brand Chloe confirmed Lena always wore. Merrill Moabs, their soles worn smooth from years of use. The tracks were crisp at first, pressed into the soft sand. There was no sign of panic, no dragging feet, no hesitation. Just a steady, confident pace heading southeast, exactly along the route she had planned. But after a mile and a half, as the wash narrowed into a deeper, darker canyon, the story the earth was telling began to change. The footprints grew lighter, less defined. They crossed a wide patch of slick rock, a stone canvas where no impression could be made. The search team marked the last clear step with a small orange flag, and after that, nothing. They fanned out in expanding spirals, brushing away dust, checking for broken twigs, disturbed soil, a dropped water bottle, anything. The canyon offered only silence in return. The strangest part was the profound isolation of the tracks. There was no sign of a second person, no prints from coyotes, not even the delicate tracings of lizards or snakes crossing her path. It was as if the desert had held its breath, opening a single, sterile corridor just for her. Later that afternoon, a ranger, frustrated with the lack of ground signs, hiked up a nearby ridge, hoping a higher vantage point would reveal something. He stood there for 10 minutes, scanning the vast, sun-drenched emptiness through his binoculars. He saw no movement, no glint of gear, no splash of color from a tent. But he did see something else. Far off, almost lost in the heat shimmer, was a dark shape nestled against a bluff. A hard, straight line that didn't belong in the soft, eroded curves of the desert. A roof, maybe. He marked the coordinates on his map. It wasn't until later, back at the command post, that someone realized the location was within the speculative range of the old, forgotten homestead. But no one acted on it right away. All eyes were on the ground, on the tracks that had started with such purpose and then, without explanation, had simply faded into nothing. The desert had decided Lena had gone far enough, and then it refused to say another word. For 6 days, the search was a war waged against silence and heat. From sunrise to sunset, teams on foot and in vehicles swept through Iron Gulch and every narrow, branching canyon that spilled off its spine. Drones, like mechanical birds of prey, mapped every elevation change, their infrared cameras scanning fruitlessly for the faintest trace of body heat. The dogs, their tongues lolling in the oppressive dryness, paced between rocks and scrub, occasionally signaling a scent only to lose it again in the swirling, indifferent wind. The search was a model of modern efficiency, a massive mobilization of technology and human will. But the desert wasn't giving anything back. Then, on day 4, just before noon, a volunteer team radioed in. Their voices were tight with the adrenaline of discovery. It wasn't Lena, but it was a piece of her world, sitting where it had no right to be. A quarter-mile off the planned trail, tucked neatly between 2 massive sandstone boulders near a shallow, dry riverbed, was a tent. It wasn't collapsed or wind-torn. It was perfect. It had been fully set up, the guy lines taut, the rainfly secure. The zippered door was closed tight against the elements. It looked as if someone had just finished preparing their camp for the night and had stepped away for a moment. Inside, the scene was even more sterile and confounding. Lena's sleeping pad was still rolled up, tied neatly with its straps. An empty water bottle lay beside it. Her small camp stove was packed in its case, unused. There was no backpack, no food, no weatherproof journal, and absolutely no sign of a struggle. It was a scene of quiet preparation, a prelude to a night under the stars that had never happened. But the most unsettling detail was what wasn't there. Surrounding the tent, in a 10-foot radius, the sand was a smooth, undisturbed canvas. There were no footprints leading to the tent. There were no footprints leading away from it. It was as if the tent had been dropped from the sky, or as if the person who set it up had simply levitated away. Even the wind, a constant artist in the desert, seemed to have avoided this single spot. It made no sense. It was a physical impossibility, a quiet, orderly crime scene with no victim, no suspect, and no entry or exit. The tent was confirmed as hers. Chloe stood inside it the next day, the desert sun filtering through the thin nylon, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She touched the rolled-up sleeping pad as if it might offer a clue. She set this up. She whispered to the empty space. She was here. And then she walked away. But she walked where and how? The desert had offered up a clue, only to surround it with 1,000 new questions. After 2 more days of finding nothing, the official search stalled, not with a bang, but with a slow, bureaucratic exhale. Air support was pulled back. The dog teams, exhausted and defeated by the terrain, were reassigned. The command post was dismantled, the maps rolled up, the volunteers sent home. The desert reclaimed its silence, and Lena Hart was still missing. Once the professionals left, speculation surged in to fill the vacuum. In the absence of facts, stories are born. At first, it was just whispers, campfire talk, rumors at the ranger station. Then it spread to online forums, missing persons blogs, and local radio call-in shows. Everyone had a theory. Some were practical, logical. She got turned around, misread her map in the confusing light. She was chasing a mirage of water that wasn't there. Desert disorientation is a real and vicious thing. The sun and shadows play tricks on the mind. Maybe she collapsed from heat stroke, her body hidden in the deep shade of a crevice. Maybe she fell, a simple, tragic accident in a place where no one thought to look. Others, including Chloe, refused to believe it. She was too smart. Chloe insisted to anyone who would listen. She was too experienced. She wouldn't just vanish. She knew what she was doing out there. That's when the darker, more human theories began. Was she taken? The nearest road was miles away, but not impossibly so. The desert towns nearby were islands in a vast sea of nothing. Easy places to disappear or to be disappeared. The pristine state of the tent was a key point. Why set it up and leave? Why no drag marks, no sign of a fight, no gear left behind unless she left with someone she trusted? or someone she was forced to trust. Then came the theories that painted Lena not as a victim, but as the architect of her own vanishing. People pointed to her recent life changes, her restlessness. They said she was looking for something. Her journals, the ones found later in her apartment, were filled with cryptic riddles, notes about dreams of cabins, about needing to step away from the noise of the world. One entry, from just the week before she left, became a mantra for this theory. It's not running away if you're running towards something. Was the homestead real? Did she find it? The speculation spiraled into the fringe. A cult, a hidden community of recluses, a secret shelter in the rocks. Some even whispered that the strange places in the desert weren't just locations. They were doors. That Lena hadn't left the trail. She had crossed over. Chloe rejected all of it. She clung to the facts, to the logic of her sister's meticulous planning. "She didn't leave me," she told reporters, her voice trembling but firm. Something happened out there, but even she, late at night, alone with her grief, replaying that final, simple text, had her doubts. In the absence of answers, the story of Lena Hart stopped being a missing persons case and became something else entirely. An echo in the desert, a myth in the making, a question that refused to end. Lena Hart didn't leave much behind in the desert, but what she left in her apartment painted a portrait far more complex and haunting than anyone expected. In the quiet, sun-drenched days after the official search stalled, her sister, Chloe, returned to the small one-bedroom apartment in Moab with a key and a heavy heart. The place was clean, organized, not the home of a person in crisis. A row of succulents stood on the windowsill, recently watered. Rent was paid through the end of the month. Her favorite bicycle was still chained to the stair rail outside. It was the apartment of a woman who fully intended to come back. But on the simple wooden kitchen table, stacked neatly and held in place by a smooth gray river stone, sat a series of journals. 5 of them. Black, cloth-bound, their covers weathered from travel. Some were filled from front to back with tight, controlled handwriting. Others held only a few scattered entries. For Chloe, reading them was like exploring a familiar landscape, only to find a hidden, bottomless canyon running right through the middle of it. She was discovering a sister she never knew. Page after page oscillated between clear-headed, almost clinical self-reflection and passages of cryptic, dreamlike prose. One page detailed a therapy session where Lena admitted to feeling split, torn between a desire to be seen and an overwhelming need to simply disappear. Another entry, dated March 14th, contained only a single chilling sentence. "If I go, it has to be quiet. No witnesses, no return." Chloe read about a painful breakup Lena had never mentioned to her family, about the guilt she felt walking away from a lucrative biotech career her parents had been so proud of. But it wasn't the pain that stood out. It was the obsession. The margins of every journal were filled with sketches. They weren't doodles. They were repetitive, precise, an unfamiliar iconography drawn over and over again. Not pictures of people or places she had actually been, but of a single recurring structure. An old cabin with a severely slanted roof, a wisp of smoke curling from an invisible chimney, always framed by jagged, imposing cliffs. Each drawing was slightly different, as if she were trying to capture it from a memory, or perhaps a dream. And with the cabins came the symbols, a triangle nested inside a circle, a crooked, leafless tree that looked more like a nerve ending, a single, open eye, always drawn beside the word arrival. It was a private language, a key to a door no one else knew existed. It looked like a map, but a map of the mind. One page, almost torn out from the force of the pen, had just 3 lines written in a shaky, excited scrawl. They were the words that would come to define the entire mystery, the words that turned a missing person case into a modern legend. I've seen it now. It's real, and it's waiting. Chloe read that line again and again, until the words lost their meaning. Seen what? What was real? And what, dear God, was waiting for her sister out there in the heat and the silence? The official narrative being built by armchair detectives was that Lena was unraveling, that she had suffered a mental break and wandered into the desert in a state of delusion. Some even whispered she had taken her own life. But Chloe, holding the journals, her sister's thoughts a physical presence in her hands, knew that wasn't it. This wasn't the writing of a person losing their mind. The detailed gear lists, the caloric intake calculations, the notes on water sources, it was all too precise, too methodical. This wasn't madness. This was intent. Lena Hart hadn't been stumbling blindly into the wilderness. She had been on a quest. She had been looking for something she believed was real, something she had seen in her dreams or in the strange liminal spaces of the desert. And whatever it was, Chloe realized with a sickening certainty, she must have found it. While Chloe was chasing ghosts on old paper maps, a real one was about to surface, captured not by a legend, but by the cold, indifferent eye of a digital camera. The clue surfaced quietly. There were no headlines, no official breakthroughs. It arrived in the form of a private email to the tip line Chloe had set up. The sender was a wildlife enthusiast, an amateur biologist from Flagstaff who had been documenting cougar populations in the Sand Hollow region for years. He had set up a dozen motion-activated trail cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elusive predators. He wasn't looking for Lena. He wasn't even aware of the specifics of her case. He was just a man watching the wilderness. One of his cameras, facing east near a dry arroyo, had triggered 4 days after Lena vanished. For months, the footage sat on a hard drive, just one clip among thousands. It wasn't until he heard Lena's story on a podcast that he went back, cross-referencing the dates. He sent the clip to Chloe with a simple, unassuming subject line. Might be nothing. It was 8 seconds long. 8 seconds of low-resolution, grayscale footage that would change everything. The clip was mundane at first. Just the silent, alien landscape of the desert. The shimmer of heat rising from the rocks, sagebrush swaying in a wind you couldn't hear. Then, at the 5-second mark, deep in the background, something moves. A figure. Thin, upright, crossing from left to right. It's distant, so much so that it could be anything. A trick of the shadows, a warped reflection from the rising heat. But, as you watch it again, frame by painstaking frame, it holds its shape. It's a human silhouette. There is no bulky backpack. There is no visible gear. Just the unmistakable shape of a person, arms at their sides, moving with steady, deliberate steps. The timestamp read 5:46 p.m., about 2 hours before sunset. The camera's GPS coordinates placed it roughly 9 miles from where Lena's empty, pristine tent had been found. The footage was immediately turned over to the rangers, where it became a source of quiet, intense debate. Some dismissed it outright. It was a heat mirage, a compression artifact, a glitch in the camera's sensor. It was nothing. Wishful thinking. But others, the more seasoned search and rescue veterans, weren't so sure. They enhanced it, running it through stabilization and contrast filters. The figure, though still blurry, was undeniably there. It moved with a fluid purpose that a trick of the light simply doesn't have. It wasn't aimless, nor was it frantic. It was just walking. A person walking across a barren stretch of earth that should have shown nothing at all. For Chloe, however, there was no debate. She watched the 8 seconds on a loop until her eyes burned, until the ghostly pixels were imprinted on her mind. She didn't see a mirage or a glitch. She saw her sister. She said it was the posture, the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of the head. It's how Lena moved when she was thinking. She whispered to the lead ranger, her voice trembling. She's not lost. She's not running. She's just processing. But there was no follow-up footage. No other cameras in the area had picked up movement. A ground search of the location turned up no prints, no gear, no secondary signs. There was just the static of the recording, and then the desert's profound silence. The footage was officially logged as inconclusive and filed away, forgotten by most. But not by Chloe. For her, those 8 seconds were proof. A proof of life, perhaps, but more than that. It was proof that the story everyone was telling about her sister, that she was a victim who had tragically perished, was wrong. The figure in that video didn't look like a victim. It looked like someone who had found what they were looking for, and who now had no intention of being found themselves. It didn't happen all at once. The stories came slowly, like water seeping through rock. They were strange, scattered, and always second-hand, but over the years a disturbing pattern began to form. While the official file on Lena Hart gathered dust, her story began to grow, transforming from a tragedy into a local myth, a piece of high desert folklore. Campers near the Copper Ridge Loop began reporting odd things. A flicker of movement at the edge of their vision. A sudden, oppressive silence where there should have been the buzz of insects. The distinct, unnerving feeling of being watched from the high ridges. Some saw lights, soft, wavering glows that were too steady for a firefly and too erratic for a flashlight. They'd blink, and the light would vanish behind a rock outcrop or sink into a wash that no longer had a trail. Some heard sounds, a slow, low humming, almost melodic, that the wind couldn't explain. Others, sitting by their fires at night, swore they heard footsteps crunching on the gravel just beyond the light's reach, only to find nothing when they spun around with a flashlight. A few, a very few, claimed to hear a woman's voice whispering their names on the wind, not yelling for help, not crying, just whispering, as if she were standing right beside them. The most persistent rumor was that of the woman in red. Hikers, often alone, claimed to see her near dusk, a distant, still figure standing on a ridgeline that had no accessible trail, wearing something the color of clay dust and firelight. She never approached, never waved. She would just stand there, unmoving, until you looked away for a second. And when you looked back, she would be gone. Rangers dismissed it all. Desert light plays tricks. Isolation makes the mind wander. But the stories kept coming, from different people in different years, all with the same unsettling details. A photographer, camped alone near Iron Gulch in 2017, woke just before dawn to find a set of small, human, barefoot prints circling his tent. But the prints didn't lead to or from the site. They just appeared. He packed up before the sun was fully up and never came back. While the desert fell quiet with these whispers, Chloe Hart refused to. She couldn't. Not while Lena was still out there, or whatever was left of her. For months after the official search ended, she pushed. But silence didn't stop her. It redirected her. In 2018, she launched a podcast. She called it Where the Road Breaks. It wasn't just about Lena, not at first. It was about disappearances in the wilderness, desert myths, the strange, unsettling gaps between the mapped and the unmapped. But the entire first season was Lena's story. Chloe told it from the beginning, her voice low, steady, and determined. She didn't sensationalize. She presented the facts, the footprints, the tent, the static on the video, the profound lack of everything else. And listeners were pulled in, not by drama, but by the haunting stillness of it all. Then she started collecting stories. Campers, hikers, ranchers, they wrote in with their own strange encounters. She never speculated. She just let the stories speak for themselves, weaving a tapestry of high strangeness that all seemed to be centered on that one patch of desert. And in every episode, you could hear it in her voice, that stubborn, exhausted hope. The podcast gained a small, devoted following. A community grew around the mystery. They didn't talk about closure. They talked about presence. The consensus among them was that Lena hadn't just left. She had stepped somewhere the rest of them couldn't follow. It was late spring of 2019, nearly 3 years after Lena vanished, when a solo hiker stumbled onto something no one expected to find. His name was Daniel Quaid, a geology student from Utah State mapping sandstone formations. Midday, just off a dry wash northeast of Iron Gulch, he paused to eat. And that's when he saw it. A stack of papers wedged beneath a cluster of flat stones. Not litter. Tucked there intentionally, sealed in a clear, zippered pouch, faded from the sun. Inside were 6 handwritten pages, smudged and caked at the edges with red dust. The ink warped from moisture, but the handwriting was still legible. Chloe received the call a week later. She met Daniel in person, holding the pouch with gloved hands, her heart pounding as she read the first line. The date on the first page was July 31st, 7 days after Lena was supposed to have returned. The entries were erratic, a mind under stress. Some were lucid descriptions of the terrain. Others read like frantic, half-remembered dream sequences. She wrote of waking up in different places from where she'd fallen asleep, of strange noises in the rocks, of the constant sense that something was watching, always just out of sight. One passage stood out, written in a shaky, desperate scrawl. I see the cabin at night. It's never in the same place. Sometimes the chimney smokes, sometimes the door is open, but I don't walk toward it. I don't think you come back if you do. Chloe recognized the handwriting immediately. Forensics later confirmed it. The Park Service didn't reopen the case. The pages were too strange, too inconclusive. But Chloe did. She launched a new season of the podcast titled The Lost Pages. The story was no longer cold. A voice had finally called out from the silence. Here is the 8th, more voluminous block of the rewrite. Block 8. By 2020, the air above Sand Hollow was no longer empty. A small but fiercely dedicated community of drone hobbyists, drawn in by the haunting narrative of Chloe's podcast, had turned their cameras and their curiosity to the desert. They were topographic sleuths, retired engineers, amateur cartographers, and weekend explorers, all united by a single obsessive goal: to find the cabin. They weren't just looking for Lena anymore. They were looking for the place that had taken her. They launched from remote pull-offs, from trucks parked on dirt roads miles from any pavement. The footage poured in. Hours upon hours of silent, gliding video showing rocky ridgelines, sun-bleached brush patterns, and deep, shadowy canyons. Most of it was nothing, just miles of beautiful, empty terrain. But every so often there was a glitch in the landscape, a shadow cast by something too square to be natural, a glint of what might have been glass on a distant slope, gone in the next frame. The desert, it seemed, didn't want to be mapped. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely of sources. Not a high-tech mapping drone, but an old, mid-range model launched by a retired postal worker named Glenn Shaw. He wasn't searching for the cabin. He was documenting erosion patterns near a wash that barely showed on modern maps. But what his camera captured shifted everything. The footage showed a dry channel bending sharply between 2 bluffs, and just before the curve, barely visible, a shape jutted from the ground at an unnatural angle. It was weather-worn, splintered, and partially buried in silt. A trail marker. Old, broken, its painted face long since scoured away by decades of wind and sun. But its shape was unmistakable. It was the remnant of a post, a signpost to a path that no longer officially existed. Glenn posted the coordinates online. Someone forwarded them to Chloe. She recognized the area immediately. It was close to a cluster of speculative pins the drone pilots had been circling for months, a blank space between mapped routes. She didn't hesitate. She packed her gear and, with 2 experienced backcountry navigators from her podcast audience, she went in. They left at dawn, crossed the wide, open canyon, and reached the site by midday. The marker was real, wooden with 2 rusted nail holes where a sign had once hung. and leading away from it, winding westward through the sandstone, was a path. It was narrow and sunken, not showing up on any GPS or topographic overlay, but it felt undeniably like a trail, pressed down over countless years by something. Feet, wheels, maybe both. They followed it. 2 hours later, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched like ink spills across the basin, they saw it. A dark line against the orange rock. A corner of a roof line, crooked and blackened, but still standing. Chloe didn't speak. She just stared. Whether it was the cabin from the legends or not, it was real, and it shouldn't have been there. They approached slowly, a sense of profound unease settling over them. Every step felt like trespassing on a place that wanted to remain forgotten. The cabin was a ruin, but a stubborn one. The roof was held up by warped, charred beams. A single chimney spine rose like a crooked finger from the rubble. It had burned, but it had not been erased. It was as if the desert had tried to swallow it and failed. The door had long since rotted off its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old ash and dust. The floor was half collapsed, but enough remained to move carefully across the warped boards. A rusted bed frame, its springs broken, a shattered kerosene lantern. And then, on the far wall, beneath a strip of peeling plaster, they saw them. The symbols, carved directly into the wooden wall, circles within circles, an open eye, the triangle nested inside a ring. The same symbols Lena had obsessively drawn in her journals, etched here with a sharp, deliberate hand. The grooves were deep, ancient. Chloe reached out a gloved hand, her fingers trembling as she traced the outline of the nested triangle. It was all real. They searched the rest of the small single room in a tense, reverent silence. And then, near what might have once been a stone hearth, they saw it. Piled in a corner, partially buried under a collapsed roof beam, was a small stack of bones. They were not scattered, as an animal would leave them. They were arranged, gathered. They were bleached white by time and sun. It wasn't a full skeleton, but it was enough to make their stomachs turn. They weren't deer bones. Later, officials would claim the findings were inconclusive. But for Chloe and the 2 volunteers who stood there in the dying light, there was no doubt. This wasn't just an abandoned ruin. It was a tomb. The story of Lena Hart had just slammed into the much older, much darker story of the Holloway place, and the mystery of what had happened here had just begun. The discovery of the cabin and the bones forced the hand of the authorities. They came in quietly. There was no press release, no official announcement. Just 2 unmarked trucks rumbling up the fire road, 4 federal agents with grim, tight faces, and 1 forensic anthropologist flown in from a university in Salt Lake City. The park rangers who had once shelved Lena's file were now back on site, their expressions a mixture of awe and unease. This was no longer their jurisdiction. Chloe wasn't invited to the excavation. She was a civilian, a family member, a podcaster, a liability. But she went anyway. She watched from a ridge nearby, her notebook in hand, pretending to record ambient audio for her show. No one stopped her, but no one spoke to her either. She was an outsider to her own sister's story. For 2 days, she watched them work, the meticulous, painstaking process of forensic archaeology. They roped off the cabin, gridding the entire area. They photographed every carving on the walls, every scrap of warped wood. Then they began to unearth the small pile of bones, each fragment brushed clean, bagged, labeled, and sent away. For days after they left, there was only silence. Then Chloe received an off-the-record call from a source inside the Park Service, someone who had seen the internal report. The results were a puzzle wrapped in a riddle. Of the recovered fragments, only one could be definitively identified as human in origin, a clavicle. It belonged to an adult female and had been in the ground, by their best estimate, for well over a decade, possibly longer. DNA tests were run against Lena's profile and against the National Database for Missing Persons. There was no match. It wasn't Lena, and it wasn't anyone else they were looking for. The official report was clinical, brief, and dismissive. The story never even made the local news. The desert had coughed up a bone, but it belonged to a ghost no one was hunting. The case was, once again, a dead end. But Chloe went back. After the agents were gone, she returned to the silent, empty cabin. She felt a pull, a need to see what they might have missed. This time she looked not at the cabin, but at what surrounded it. Behind the collapsing rear wall stood a cluster of twisted, wind-beaten juniper trees, their bark warped into ribbons by decades of sun and sand. And on those trees was a secret history. Initials, dates, carved into the bark, layered over one another like graffiti on a city wall. DJ 1974, RT plus MT 1981, Elena 1996. It was a hidden guest book, a testament to all the other wanderers who had found this impossible place. One carving, etched lower than the others, was just a spiral, gouged deep into the wood. But one carving made Chloe's breath catch in her throat. It was clean, deep, the letters a little too neat to be random. LH 2011, the same initials. But the year was wrong. Utterly, impossibly wrong. 2011. The year before, Lena had even moved to Moab. Years before, she was supposed to have become obsessed with this place. Chloe stared at it, her hand hovering near the bark, not daring to touch it. Had Lena been here before? Was this whole story, this whole quest, a return to a place she already knew? Or had someone else carved it? A marker? A warning? She photographed every carving, her mind reeling. The desert wasn't just keeping one secret, it was a library of them. Chloe waited a week. Then she hit record. The new podcast episode was called Cabin Found. It was quiet, focused, just her voice, steady and sharp over the sound of the desert wind. She laid out the facts in order: the forgotten path, the burned structure, the symbols, the inconclusive bones, and finally, the impossible carving on the tree. She didn't speculate. She didn't have to. The world did that for her. The episode ignited a firestorm. Her inbox was full within hours, and among the dozens of emails from listeners and amateur sleuths, one stood out. There was no subject line, just a Dropbox link and a single chilling sentence. "You're not wrong. Watch frame 147. Chloe clicked the link. The video was more drone footage, standard 4K, skimming over the desert. The camera glided east across a bluff that she now recognized near the cabin site. Nothing unusual, until frame 147. She paused the video. There, in the corner of the frame, barely visible through the sun's glare, was a figure. A flash of red, upright, still. It wasn't a trick of the light. It had form. It had edges. It was a person. The drone swept past. For 3 frames, the figure was there. In the 4th, it was gone. Chloe didn't share the footage, not yet. Instead, she recorded a short follow-up, just her voice trembling slightly. "I've seen something," she said. "It's real. I don't know what it means yet, but it changes everything." She ended the episode with the words Lena had once scribbled in the margins of her journal. "I've seen it now. It's real, and it's waiting. Here's the 10th and final block of the rewrite." Block 10. The footage was sent to 2 separate digital forensics labs, one in Oregon, one in Virginia. The verdict came back faster than expected and was unanimous. The file was raw, untampered. The image metadata, GPS, timestamp, bit rate, was all consistent. The analysts built 3D simulations of the terrain, mapping where the light would have fallen that evening. Their conclusion was unsettling. The figure wasn't a reflection or a glitch. It was a physical object, 3-dimensional, casting a narrow, elongated shadow toward the bluff's edge. What they couldn't explain was its stillness. People move, even when they think they're standing still. They sway, they shift their weight, their hair moves in the wind. But the figure in red held its form with an unnatural, statue-like precision for all 1.8 seconds it was visible. As one technician said in the official briefing, A call Chloe listened to in silence. It's not nothing, and it's not normal. Before Chloe could even process the report, a second email arrived. It was from a different anonymous user, a wildlife photographer who had seen the first clip on a forum. I flew in the same quadrant that day, the message read. Different altitude. Check timestamp 6:43 p.m. Something's there. Chloe opened the new video file, her heart pounding. The angle was higher, the late sun cast in a golden glow. And there, on the same ridge, was the same figure in red. But this time, she was facing the camera. The distance was too great to make out a face, but the outline was clearer. Arms at her sides, head tilted slightly, as if listening, as if she knew she was being watched and had allowed it. The two clips were synced. The timestamps matched to the second. Two drones, piloted by strangers hundreds of miles apart, had captured the same impossible moment from two different angles. The internet ignited. The story of Lena Hart, the ghost of Sand Hollow, became a viral phenomenon. But, amid the noise and speculation, Chloe went back. With a small team from the podcast, she returned to the cabin one last time. This time, they searched not for clues, but for secrets, and they found one. Behind a loose wall panel near the hearth was a hollow space. Inside, wrapped in a faded scarf, was a cracked plastic ID card bearing Lena's smiling, pre-desert face, and beside it, a shattered, water-damaged cell phone. The phone took specialists days to revive. The screen was dead, the battery corroded, but the storage chip held. Most of the files were corrupted. But there was one intact audio clip, 22 seconds long. It began with the sound of shallow, uneven breathing. Then, a soft shuffle of gravel, a long stretch of that same eerie, empty silence from the desert. And then, at the 15-second mark, a voice, Lena's voice, raw, strained, and barely a whisper. They don't come during daylight, only when it's quiet. The file ended. The message hung in the air, a final, chilling warning from a place beyond understanding. The search teams went out one more time, armed with this new knowledge. They found the shelter she'd built, a shallow alcove where she had survived. And they found the final, inexplicable clue. Footprints, half buried in loose shale near the eastern ridge. Two distinct sets. One, an adult female, consistent with Lena's trail runners. The other set was smaller, much smaller. The prints were light, the stride short. They were the prints of a barefooted child. They followed the twin trails for nearly a mile before they simply vanished onto flat, hard stone. A lost child? A ghost? The desert offered no answers. The official case was never closed, but it was never solved. It was quietly shelved, a story too strange to have an ending. Chloe stopped the podcast. She let the silence return. The world moved on, but the story of Lena Hart remained, an echo in the canyon. Some say she is the woman in red, a guardian of a place not meant for the modern world. Others say she found a door in the desert and chose not to come back. The truth is, no one knows. The last verified image of her came 3 weeks after her phone was found. Another drone, another lucky shot. But this time, she wasn't standing still. The footage showed a figure in red, running fast and purposefully along a high ridge, away from the cabin, toward the rising sun. And running beside her, keeping pace, was a smaller, shadowy figure. She wasn't running from something. She was running with someone. Not all who vanish are lost. Some stories are not meant to be solved. They are meant to become a part of the silence, a part of the land. A reminder that there are still maps that are not finished, and places in the world where the road simply breaks.